Well, thank you, Steve, for joining us here today. So most people who are kind of interested in British politics probably already know about Steve, but I'm going to give a brief overview. He's been the Conservative MP for Wickham since 2010, so getting on 11 years now. He did an undergraduate degree in aeronautical engineering. I know we've got at least one aeronautical engineering student on the call, followed by a master's at Oxford in computer science, my own field. Then he was an RAF engineering officer for 10 years and has been CTO of various other tech roles and companies before being an MP, being the chair of the ERG twice from 2016 to 17 and 2019 to 20. He's been the deputy chair at one point and has been on the Transport and Treasury Select Committees. And I believe you're still on the Treasury one. Yeah. So Steve, I'll give you a few minutes to kind of do an introductory talk and then we'll hand over to questions. When we do questions, please either type your question in the chat or indicate there that you have a question. I'll come to you. You can either then ask your question out loud or I will read it out for you.
Well, Ben, thanks very much indeed for this invitation to come and have a Q&A with you. I really appreciate it. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what you would like to discuss. So I will just be brief, but it is fantastic that you're there. To have a university Conservative association is a great thing. And I'm really grateful to you for the invitation. I mean, it's an amazing time to be in British politics. It's been quite a tumultuous few years by any historical standard. And of course, I'm privileged to have been in the centre of that one way or another. Obviously, we're now hopefully at the end stages of the pandemic and on our way out. We still need to settle into our new position, having left the European Union, delivering the trade deals, deciding how we're going to regulate differently within the UK and so on to promote prosperity. Those two things now, of course, come together because the public finances are in a terrible, terrible mess, propped up by absolutely unprecedented quantitative easing. I mean, the hundreds of billions are starting to really add up now. Be very interesting to know what you guys think of that. We're going to need at some stage to get those public finances into order, and that will be tricky, particularly tricky when we've got now a very large backlog in healthcare, and people will want to see us make sure we've stewarded the NHS in the way that they would wish. Thankfully, schools, at least in Wickham, are doing great, and teachers have been fantastic through this crisis. But young people have had, again, a terrible time, particularly if they had exams in the course of this pandemic. So, we need to really go out of our way to try and look after people as we've come through this. And we need to go through the process of healing up broken bonds, both from coronavirus and from the response to coronavirus. And of course, residually from leaving the European Union, there's still people around who are very bruised about that. So I think the political challenges before us all are quite substantial, and they are before us all, including you guys. You are interested in politics, you're participants, you're on social media, I don't doubt, you're talking to people about politics at university. And I want to put it to you that what all of us do really counts. That's just a suspension of the comments, it doesn't matter. So what we do really matters. People listen to what we say. And, in a sense, we're all representatives of the Conservative Party. And I suppose if I was to put in a word to you, what my plea would be is we've got to be kind to one another. There's all sorts of difficulties floating around at the moment, which could be resolved if we just listen to one another a little bit more carefully. And although it's not very popular in politics, if we were a bit slower to criticise, condemn and complain, but if we were to just keep on keeping on explaining why it is that we think Conservative ideas work best, because the long course of human history has shown that whenever socialism's really seriously tried with the nationalisation of property, state control, it's always a disaster. So we need to keep being, as I've said elsewhere, radically moderate. Happy to explain that if you like, but radically moderate, and that's another way of saying, in a way, conservative. So looking after people, looking after our institutions, going through the necessary process of change sufficiently slowly that people can come with us. And if we do take that sort of approach, I believe we will rise to meet all the challenges that we face. I certainly believe that we can create an ever greater future for ourselves, including all of you, because that, again, is the long story of human history. If you have a look at the humanprogress.org website, things always get better. And in the midst of all our difficulties, we do need to remember that human ingenuity is the greatest engine of progress. and together we will secure a better future, come out of this crisis and go forward together.
Absolutely. So guys, get your questions in. So I'm going to start off with kind of an easy one. I know you covered this slightly on an LBC podcast, but obviously people say that the people who make the best MPs have come from a non-politics background. So how do you think being in the RAF and then in various tech roles has prepared you for life in politics?
Well, it's taught me to get stuff done. I mean, the Royal Air Force's training is all about leadership and getting things done, people in the right place, right time, doing the right things, monitoring the task, the team, the individual, making sure the right standards are met, all those sorts of things, communicating. Hopefully I do some of that quite well, at least. So that was great training. And of course, being in the private sector subsequently was great to be reminded that you do actually have to deliver value and raise invoices if you want to be paid. Not everybody lives off tax. People do actually have to satisfy their customers in business. But I by no means want to say that mine's the only way into politics. There's a wide variety of people here, and some of the people who've been special advisors also have had accomplished careers in business. So we must never rush to judgment. And even if people have spent their whole career one way or another in politics, that is also a justifiable thing to do. If somebody's been a parliamentary researcher and worked for an MP, then they really know how it goes. They know how the House of Commons works. They know how the public relate to MPs. They've learned to cope with all of the terrible anger and anguish that is thrown at us. So I would say it's very important to have a wide variety of members of Parliament, and no one route in is superior to any other. In the end, it's a democracy, and we will get the MPs we deserve in that democracy.
Yeah, a good answer. So guys, do submit your questions. I know you probably have questions, so if you're don't feel shy. Do keep submitting them.
And by all means, we've got a nice small group. We can make it a conversation. If you want to go to and fro over some of these things, I'm very glad to do that.
I'd ask a question.
Essentially, go ahead.
So I believe you've expressed interest in having a gold standard reintroduced.
Not quite as directly as that, no. I think it's impractical to have a global gold standard, and I think if I were to propose it, or if anyone were to propose it, it'd be slightly laughed out of court. As anyone who watches Treasury Committee will know, I have a declarable interest in something called Glint Pay, and there is also cryptocurrencies variously. We're now talking about stable coins, which are redeemable against fiat money, and central bank digital currency. So what I think is now happening is, through financial technology, we're getting to the point that competing currencies are happening. And on Treasury Committee this week, I put it to one of the candidates to join one of the bodies, the Financial Policy Committee, that what's happening is that the private sector, entrepreneurs and innovators, are creating a market in alternative currencies. And in a sense, what the state needs to do is decide whether it's going to assert its right to a monopoly over currency. So the things that Hayek wrote about when he wrote the denationalization of money in the 70s, because he'd given up on fiat monies, he thought it was a lost cause, and he thought that fiat monies should compete. So not go back to the gold standard, but have fiat monies competing. And when he wrote that book, he could never have foreseen what we have today. But, I think it's an incredibly exciting time in monetary theory. When I was first elected, I wanted to shift the debate. I don't know the extent to which I've shifted it, but it certainly has been shifted, but it's mostly been shifted by technology. So the reason that I invested in Glint is because what Glint is doing is putting gold back into the payment system, and you can spend physical gold in a vault using contactless, just like anybody else. And it's dead straightforward, and you can hold multiple fiat currencies and gold. And personally, I think that's the right way to go about it. I've got the tiniest little bit of Bitcoin left, mostly because I was able to sell it at a good time. But, I've had some Bitcoin. I think these are all very interesting technologies, but I don't think there's any prospect of going onto a gold standard. But it certainly is a real thing that people who want to hold gold can now do so. There's gold money as well, another competing product. So lots of exciting things are happening with money. But going back to a pure gold standard internationally is vanishingly unlikely. What do you want to do, Dom?
In life or with monetary policy?
On this, to your question about gold, what is your opinion of it?
Yeah, I mean, I sit in a similar area, I suppose. It's not realistic. I don't think Britain is in a situation either where it's something that there is currently a need for either. I mean, I guess you might want it if your inflation was incredibly high, but I mean, today's US inflation figures are a lot worse than our inflation figures are today. So I don't think it's somewhere where a discussion that needs to be had right now, but always something,
this is one of
the
my
value of
favorite
money.
Yeah, it's one of my favourite subjects, and in a sense, the reason to have the discussion is in advance of there being a really serious problem. If you want to know a really good essay that encapsulates the issues, it's written by a very, very famous central banker called Alan Greenspan, who I'm confident you'll have heard of, and it's called Gold and Economic Freedom. Gold and Economic Freedom by Alan Greenspan, and he's never resigned from it, although obviously the policy he put into practice was different because he moved with the times. But I thoroughly recommend it. But we've had an enormous expansion in the supply of money since the Bretton Woods currency system ended in the year I was born, feels a long time ago now. And we now have QE. And the big question, which we're all going to find answered in the next few years, certainly in our lifetime, is this a good thing? And, you know, at least now we've got cryptocurrencies and re-emergence of gold in the private sector. So we have at least got alternatives. But personally, what I think is we'll end up moving over to central bank digital currency. But whether that's a good thing also remains to be seen.
Yeah, because there was a thing recently, wasn't there? I can't remember if it was the UK or the US, kind of thinking about heavy regulation of cryptocurrency, removing kind of one of the
I was
main
about to talk about that. So the Basel report has recently been quite intense regulations. I'm reading here in the Financial Times.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure what your thoughts are around that.
What the regulation of cryptocurrency?
Yeah.
Well, so if you just sort of rewind slightly, the state hates competition. You can see it with the recent agreement on the international tax on corporations. Now, obviously, it's right that nobody should be exempting themselves from taxes, but this, you know, nation states are not having a competition to attract investment based on their tax rates. They're actually going against that previously historic trend with that agreement. But the same, I think, is true of money, and particularly if you read that Alan Greenspan article. The reason that we've had an enormous expansion in the supply of currency, normally through debt, but then through QE, is in order to prop up state spending. Now, normally the process is hidden when it's credit expansion adding to the supply of money. But at the moment, it's dead straightforward because it's written down in the OBRs, the Office for Budget Responsibilities reports. They plainly say in those reports that the amount of QE being done is broadly the same as the amount of bonds being issued by the government. So if you ask yourself very simply, where are we getting the money from that we're borrowing in the bond market? And the answer, I'm afraid, is indirectly from the Bank of England through QE. So the
question is, what do we do about that?
Well, indeed. So there's a YouTube video in which I try and go through some of the data and try and give my answer, but just to tease apart some of these issues. So the state doesn't like competition. And one of the reasons it doesn't like competition is it needs us to be using the state's money in order to keep doing what it does, which is funding public spending by debauching the currency. But this has always been what monarchs do, what rulers do. They tax and then they reach the limits of taxation, then they borrow, eventually they reach the limits of borrowing, and then they debauch the currency. And debauching the currency used to be done by clipping coins. I've got a real coin here somewhere. I have an ounce of silver. You might guess the reason that I have an ounce of silver. It's because I can't afford to leave an ounce of gold lying around, but that's an ounce of real money. So they used to clip the edges off coins and replace the weight with tin, for example. But that isn't how it's done anymore. It's now done with QE and hardly anyone understands it. But the reason that it's done is because so many promises have been made to the public. We live in a huge age of interventionism where everybody seems to believe the state is omnipotent. And the result is that the pressure on the public purse is well, it would be beyond the recognition of people like Gladstone. And Gladstone and Disraeli would scarcely have recognised the way we live today.
It's impossible. I just wonder how it's all going to collapse.
Well, yeah. So I put that on. So just to tease one thing up, because I'm trying to give you, let me just collect my thoughts. So I don't think the state likes competition, so they're bound to want to regulate cryptocurrencies. At the moment, as we discussed on Treasury Committee, they're not really widely enough spread to be a problem, other than perhaps for money laundering, which does raise some really important issues. So when it comes to how does it collapse, so I went through this with this sequence with the Chancellor to make sure it was on the record. You mentioned inflation. The Bank of England's inflation target, as you know, is 2% and symmetrical. So as the Bank of England's told us, if inflation starts going much above target, they will have to act to get inflation under control. And they also told us on the record, under my questioning, that it's not their job to keep the bond markets going. So I want you to imagine that inflation were to come up to, say, 4%. Well, that's not too high. It's certainly not a hyperinflation. It's 4%, but it's above target. But they might say we're looking through that 4% because that's to do with our recovery from coronavirus and various other factors. So we're looking through that because we're expecting inflation to come back to target. This is about expectation management, because a really important phenomenon in inflation is psychology and what people expect is going to happen. So they say we expect inflation coming back to target, and we're looking through the 4%. But if it's then 5, 6, 7%, eventually the Bank of England will have to act. When they act, we'll probably get something called a taper tantrum. The bond markets, once they realise that the Bank of England is tapering off their bond purchases, bond market players will probably be far less willing to lend the money to the government. And that could either manifest itself in a failure of a bond market auction or in interest rates rising perhaps dramatically. Now, that could end up pulling the plug on government spending. And if the Prime Minister faces a choice between dramatically and suddenly cutting public spending on things which people really need, let's not pretend things are other than they are. You know, we're talking about pensions and healthcare and education. It's very serious. And given a choice between suddenly cutting spending and raising taxes, or changing the remit of the Bank of England, I think it's much more likely that the remit of the Bank of England will be changed. And then we really are off to the races, because that could change people's inflation expectations and so on, as well as legitimising further money creation in an environment of higher inflation. So if you ask how does it collapse, that's how I think it collapses, through inflation coming in even at quite low levels, forcing the bank to act up until the point that the mandate of the bank is changed, and then really exactly what is done in those circumstances will really matter. Now, if I'm wrong, and if things work out the way we'd all like it to work out, because I don't, of course, want these difficulties, then hopefully inflation will stay low and stable and growth will come back, and we will naturally balance the books without major cuts. And we'll go on to growth and prosperity without a major crisis. But I think it's my duty as a Treasury Select Committee member who's studied monetary matters to sort of flesh these things out and make sure the risks have been considered.
Yes, because on the bonds, it will really depend. Because I don't know the stats, especially for UK government bonds, kind of what the profiles are of the people getting them. And is it that kind of elderly pensioners are preferring US Treasury bonds because obviously they prefer fixed income to things like stocks?
I haven't got those figures to hand either, but if you go to the Debt Management Office, they produce reports on who is the holder of these bonds. But again, I just refer you back to the Bank of England. You know, the Bank of England's done almost $1 trillion of QE. And that means the Bank of England's a very major holder of our bonds.
Not a good situation for anyone, really, not even the Bank of England.
No, it's very serious. It's very serious by any historic standard. So there, you know, Jan Verlege, a member of the Monetary Policy Committee, gave a speech. It might have been a webinar, I forget now. And he compared what they're doing to Weimar and Zimbabwe. But he did that in order to make the point that the difference is in the UK, we have an independent central bank. But that's a way, in a sense, of signalling that, yes, the Bank of England will pull the plug on the bond markets rather than let inflation get out of hand. which is great if you think that the government won't ask Parliament to change, or rather the chance. Well, it may or may not require legislation depending what's done. But if you think that the government will prioritise inflation over paying pensions, then that in a sense that's fine from Blager's point of view. But these are incredibly serious issues. But I'm very interested. Tim keeps popping back up. I'm interested to know what Tim thinks about it. But I'm afraid I think these are also very ancient issues that civilizations have lived through before. And the thing we're going to have to do eventually is live within our means. But that may not be that much fun for a while.
I have no idea why I keep popping up. I think it perhaps is something just to do with Zoom.
I think it's because you're not on mute. So every time there's a background noise, pop up.
Oh yeah. Yeah, you have very interesting points. I certainly think so.
But what we mustn't do through all this difficult, I'm exposing you to things which I'm glad I wasn't exposed to when I was at university. These are very, very serious matters. But what I would say to you is don't lose hope, because actually civilizations had crises in the past, and I'm not expecting us to have the worst crisis our civilization's known. In the worst case, we'll have a very difficult monetary situation, which we will then resolve and go on. But as I say, the good news now is that private entrepreneurial effort has now not only provided solutions, but it's also inspired the central banks to come up with their own solutions using technology, which can provide replacement money. So I am not worried that we can't solve these problems. I just think on the way through to solving them, there might be some considerable difficulty. But forgive me, this is a really important point. If you remember nothing else in this conversation, try to remember this. Whatever difficulties that we may have in the years ahead, it cannot be said that they will have been caused by having government that was too small, taxes that were too low, budgets that were too often in surplus, and money that was too sound. Because if you ask yourself those questions and look at the data, the long history is that we've had big government beyond the limits of taxation, with deficit spending and unsound money, with the currency being debased. So, what my message to you is, we as Conservatives have basically been right all along. But that's because we live in the real world and do sensible, practical things, unlike some of our opponents who, very often refuse to face up to the world as it is.
Yeah, because we could end up returning to what David Cameron inherited in 2010, whereas mountains of debt that were incredibly high percentage of GDP, huge governments, the government not living within its means and having to do huge numbers of cuts, which, well, he then said that he probably should have cut more. I'm not sure everyone would have agreed with him on that, but I think even now, especially with more kind of younger people getting involved, and anytime the word cut is mentioned, you have people going off on social media, which David Cameron didn't have quite as much back in 2010. So
no,
it's
indeed.
Very difficult for the government.
Yeah, when I was first elected, David Cameron was able to dismiss Twitter with a joke. But now, everybody who's in politics seems to be on Twitter. And certainly the main reason that I use Twitter is in order to communicate not only with the public, but with the journalists. I know journalists follow me and I can communicate with them. But, I would like to think that I was communicating with all the voters of Wickham on Twitter. But, Twitter take up generally in the population is not that high. It's higher on Facebook. So generally, I use Facebook to communicate with my voters, Twitter to communicate generally on a campaigning basis and with journalists. But yeah, you're right. David could joke about Twitter.
Your Twitter is very different to most MPs. And what I like about yours is you have lots of kind of statistics and kind of well thought out layouts of your tweets, rather than just kind of incoherent rambles that you get from
Ben, I'm honoured.
MPs.
Do you know why that is? It's because my staff do an absolutely fantastic job of preparing my tweets.
I'm sure they do.
Now, I also do my own as well, but yeah, well, I think we're all learning all the time and getting better at it. I've tried to. One of the reasons I bought this big TV, which by the way I paid for myself, is because I like to be able to sit here and do little videos which look like this, and try and get clips out. We're all learning all the time. What do the public need? People have been writing to us today about weddings. So I knocked out a video explaining that I've been long concerned about weddings, and I do believe it's time for us to get on and let people plan. So, trying to use social media to communicate is going on all the time.
So I suppose as a ponderance, I'm currently vice chair of Hammersmith Conservative Association. I know the chairman himself, Mark Higton, has great respect for you. What is the most useful and effective thing we can do to, well, obvious, the most useful and effective thing to improve society, I suppose?
Well, I think the most useful thing we can do, quite honestly, is one of the hardest things to do, and that is we have to make our doctrines attractive. Not only the ideas and the practice. Our opponents love to dismiss what we say as philosophical or academic or whatever, but I'm afraid ideas do matter. I mean, you were kind enough in the introduction, Ben, to refer to me as an aerospace and software engineer, but of course, being an aerospace engineer in particular, and indeed a software engineer, they both teach you that it's very important if you're doing something practical and real to have a very
we're both software engineers. We both did degrees in computing.
Very well. You will know that if you're doing something very practical, like writing a complex piece of software, it's a very good idea to have a great theoretical grasp of how software works and how problems in software engineering are solved. And equally in aerospace, I was responsible for the airworthiness of combat aircraft. And you would like to think that an airworthiness engineer, practically responsible for getting aircraft in the air, understood the theory of aerospace engineering. So for me as a politician, there's no tension between ideas and practical action. They're complementary. Now, if you were to read an article called, it was originally a lecture, but How to Advance the Ideas of Liberty by a guy called Leonard Read, and he founded the Foundation for Economic Education. But if you just Google How to Advance Liberty, Leonard Read, and have a read of that. But one of the things he taught us is you have to learn what liberty is and what it isn't. It's a really important thing to do. And that's a life's work. But also you have to try and make freedom attractive. Now I may fail, but I'm always trying to make liberty attractive. I think we would all be better off if the state did less in our lives. So things like planning. The planning system just strips us of our property rights. There's two really dominant features in the housing market. The control of interest rates by and the supply of credit by the central banking and regulatory regime, but that's the state pumping cheap credit into housing. And I've actually heard a chancellor say that's how the economy works. We pump cheap credit into housing, build some houses, and that gets us a boom going. Well, okay, what are the side effects? And are those side effects what we want? And the other factor, of course, in housing is that the state controls land use. I once had a group of farmers say to me, talking about diversification and farming, they said, Steve, the best diversification we could have is if you just let us build 1 or 2 houses in the corner of a field every year.
I agree 100%. Almost most of our problems currently come down to the ridiculously high cost of housing, which is simply a lack of supply.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's lack of supply. But I do think, personally, I also think that there is a problem with the way that credit has been expanded into mortgages, driving up the demand. But let's not get back onto the monetary problem. But either way, both those things are issues with the state. The planning system is one of the pillars of post-war socialism, and we as Conservatives keep trying to make it work. What we should be doing is definitely profoundly changing it. And I set out on the record in a speech several years ago how that should be done.
It's excellent.
Theresa May, for instance, seems to think exactly the opposite. She's opposed to the idea of the current planning reforms that were proposed by the government.
Yeah, there's no getting away from it that people who own their own homes tend to be, or more likely to be, Conservative voters. And one of the missions of a Conservative should be to increase people's property. You know, freedom and property are tightly interrelated, and particularly if you own a house or you own land, then what you do within your own property is your choice, or within, so there are bounds. But the point is that your property is a space which is yours. And you choose what curtains and carpets and appliances and how you behave in your own home and so on. And the point is that property is the boundaries around which you have your own freedom and space. So when somebody has a house, we should seek to keep the person in that house and encourage others into their own homes. Those two things then come into tension when the building of new houses damages the view or the amenity of someone else's home. And for many Tory MPs, they're opposed to planning reforms when they fear that their voters are going to be up in arms because their view's been spoiled, or there's more cars on the road, or whatever it may be. And what we need is a reformed system. In economic terms, it's called internalising the externalities. So basically, people are compensated. People are compensated when they suffer because houses are built. And there's a book called Liberating the Land by Mark Pennington, published by the IEA. I made a speech about that book and explained it to my voters at a time when they cared. And you know what? They were very supportive.
So I'm quite interested. So you described yourself earlier as a radical moderate. So could you expand on exactly what you mean by that?
So we've got a time now where we've got some really serious problems to deal with. And serious problems require serious solutions. There's an old Shakespearean quote, I can't remember from where it comes, but diseases desperate grown are by desperate remedy, desperate appliance relieved or not at all. Diseases desperate grown are by desperate appliance relieved or not at all. And so we do need to take some, we're going to need to take some bold steps, I think, in our lifetime to solve these problems. So that's in a sense the radical bit, but we've got to be radically moderate, because mere radicalism just frightens everybody. We've got to be moderate in what we do. And the reason I say moderate is because we are Conservatives. Even those of us who are, classical liberals or libertarian, we're still Conservative, because, we need to do what we do in ways which carry the public and are gentle. So when I say radically moderate, it's partly its messaging to convey to people this juxtaposition of two different ideas: radical yet moderate, radically moderate. I'm not merely moderate, I'm radically moderate. And it's a way of just trying to communicate to people that what I'm saying, that they aren't sometimes new ideas, but they're new ideas based on old ones. So go to any of our most prized towns and look at the place. People in planning are always talking about place. But the places that we most value, like, for example, High Wycombe Town Centre, or Marlow Town Centre, or Henley Town Centre, or whatever, these are all amazing, historic, picturesque places which predate the Town and Country Planning Act, often by hundreds of years. And the point is that humanity is perfectly capable of developing place and buildings and infrastructure without the state doing it. And we've tended to forget. But the railways, the canals, and then the railways, and indeed the roads, were built through private enterprise. Yes, the Romans built roads for military purposes, but that was, that was hundreds of years interval between then and the turnpikes. But railways,
I'm really not sure why Labour are so obsessed with brutalism or similarly ugly developments.
I think there's something philosophical about it. But remember, there's really only three really important political doctrines. Liberalism, the idea of maximising human freedom, which unfortunately the Liberal Democrats don't especially stand for. Socialism, which really means planning, it means control, it means the use of power over resources, taking people's property, holding it collectively and handing it over to officials to administer. And conservatism, which of course means, whoa, everyone slow down. We're moving too fast. Let's not change the institutions that we have. And it can be said that when socialism and conservatism go wrong, you end up with the totalitarian doctrines we suffered in the 20th century. So that maybe gives you 5 if you add fascism and communism. But I see it as more of a sort of circle. You've got at the bottom, the ant heap of totalitarianism, as Reagan called it, and at the top, the maximum of human freedom, consistent law and order. And you're either heading up or down on that circle one way or another. So when I say we're radically moderate, what I mean is we need to take the ideas which we know from human history work very well at promoting life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and then apply those ideas really quite definitely and with conviction. And that's really the approach and try and make it attractive while we're doing it. And that's really the approach I'm commending to you.
Yes, it's quite interesting at the moment watching, especially the Labour Party kind of flounder, even with, so local elections were an absolute disaster for them. And I even saw, I think it was on Mock the Week, Ed Byrne saying there are two things about the local elections in Hartlepool that surprised him. One, that Labour's campaign entirely seemed to be, we're not the Tories. And two, that it didn't work. So obviously we've got, what, like 3 years, maybe less, since we've got the dissolution and calling of Parliament bill due for second reading soon. So it could be earlier than 3 years. But let's say it is 2024, by then we've had 14 years of Conservative government, including the coalition, which is probably one of the longest, I don't know exactly historically, of one party. So we've been in real danger at that point of kind of swinging back to Labour. It's kind of thing that happened with Thatcher, then Labour for a while, then back to Conservatives. So what is it that you think the Conservative Party can offer the country at that point? Because they've got to have a strike a fine balance, because the people in the southeast particularly are not going to enjoy the kind of big government that we've been having at the moment. But then we've also got to balance trying to now keep the north that we're seeming to be winning back from Labour, who want different things, to the south. So what do you think the balance is that the government needs to strike?
So the Conservative Party is very good at reinventing itself in power. That's what we've done. That's what Boris Johnson has done. And that's what we can do again. Now, I think historically, no opposition has ever overturned a majority as big as the one that we have in a single general election. It's a remarkable thing that our majority is as big as it is. And it shows how disconnected Labour had become from their voters. But when you ask, what can we offer the public? Well, what we can offer the public is liberty under the rule of law. That's what we should always be offering the public. I think if the Conservative Party doesn't stand for freedom, then it doesn't stand for anything. So we're going to need to reinvent ourselves. I think when money gets difficult, we're going to need to reinvent ourselves into a party that once again can seem to be positively putting into action the ideas and the practice of freedom, and through doing that, generate the resources that we need to spend to look after people.
This is completely excellent, Steve, just listening to you. So I'm a fellow aero boy by trade. So I've just finished here, and I know Ben finishes a couple of weeks after me in computer science. And it's great to see an MP that's so level-headed. Literally, it's letting the people have what they would like and need to grow and lead their own lives with minimal state intervention. The one thing that does worry me slightly is Labour still don't seem to get it. And we've seen this very recently in universities especially, although Gavin Williamson's done some things to try and halt that kind of advancing little socialist Trojan horse. The thing that worries me is, are they just going to keep getting more and more radical on their side? At some point, will a boot have to be put down, or do we risk having a situation where the Tory party itself then fractures slightly if Labour goes by the lay side slightly?
Yeah. Okay. So a point actually, just to pick up on finishing the previous one, is I think it's a myth. I'm told by my friends in the north that it is a myth to think the Labour voters coming to us want big state socialism. It might be that they were voting Labour for historic reasons, that Labour was the party of their class in that they saw
they support freedom.
Yeah, but the lady who runs Emily Barlow, who runs Rotherham Conservative group, they had 0 councillors. They now have 20. Emily founded Conservatives for Liberty, and I'm glad to be one of her supporters. Actually, I would like for her to be an MP. But Emily is, she is a northern working class lass, and she wouldn't mind me saying it in those terms. And She tells me, and she's written on Conservative Home, that it's a mistake to think that former Labour voters in the North want socialism and that we should give it to them. I think if we give them ideas and practice which will work in their lives, on the very real things that they care about, then they'll vote for us. And we shouldn't make ourselves socialists on the mistaken premise that former Labour voters want the nonsense that Jeremy Corbyn would have actually delivered. I mean, he said lots of things which people could. Jeremy Corbyn is quite good at articulating suffering, and there is real suffering we need to deal with. You know, food bank use in Wickham has soared, and that is a matter of shame, and I would like to deal with it. But we're not going to deal with it by adopting socialism. So to your point about Labour, I was speaking with a Labour MP this morning, because we do have sort of friendships and allegiances across the Commons. And I said to him, isn't one of your problems that all the communists who'd previously splintered off to their different communist parties rejoined the Labour Party? And he said, yes. And I said, but surely they'll just leave when it becomes clear you're not going to be a communist party. And, you know, he said that is partly in progress. Some have left. But there is an existential battle on for the soul of Labour. Are they going to be a communist party, whatever they call it? Or are they going to be a basically Blairite party? And it was Mandelson pointed out, wasn't he? I can't do it, but out of 11, wasn't it? That, you know, either Tony Blair was Prime Minister, was leader of the Labour Party, or they lost for years and years and years. So the Labour movement needs to decide whether it wants to win elections. And if it wants to win elections, it's going to have to find its next Tony Blair and move to the centre. George Osborne said something about, in opposition, you move to the centre, and in government, you move the centre. So Osborne said something like that, and I think he's probably right. So we can't be complacent. And in a sense, for me, one of the problems and one of the blessings and joys of the Conservative Party is that so much of the legitimate spectrum of useful political debate exists within our family. Classical liberals like me, I'm an old English Manchester liberal is how I like to think of it, versus high Tories like John Hayes. Now, John Hayes and I will often agree on practically what should be done, but he does regard me with horror as a liberal, and I regard him as an old high Tory with great fondness. But, you know, John Hayes and I end up agreeing and believing in many of the same things. But how we approach problems and progress is quite different. He quite likes what Boris is doing, big high spending stuff, whereas I recoil from some of it.
I think it's quite interesting because most people I've spoken to when out campaigning, well, fellow Conservative volunteers, mainly have been classical liberals like myself and like you. But obviously the party is much, much wider than the Labour Party ever is. And it's the same thing in the United States as well. The right-wing party has much more diversity of opinion than the left-wing party. The problem with Labour, especially in 2019, was they just took all the views from London and the Southeast, which were the ones that were very vocal on social media, and didn't realise that it wasn't outside of that area that anyone held those views. So they did very well in London, as they normally do. They got a few seats in the Southeast and a few kind of in places they normally get. But I mean, without Scotland, they're pretty much screwed for a majority government, really. Since
John McDonnell has joined me over. So, funnily enough, I get on reasonably well with John McDonnell. I wouldn't have wanted him to be Chancellor, but maybe there's something about individualism versus collectivism. Those of us who are individualists, properly understood, you know, we like to think for ourselves, whereas maybe collectivists like to all just follow the consensus and find their self-worth in agreeing with other people. I mean, I like agreeing with other people, but I also prefer to have thought things through for myself. I must just check my diary and see when I'm due, what the next thing is that I'm due to do. Forgive me, because I think I've got to join a call at 5 exactly, so I can't allow this to run beyond 5.
Yeah, so we'll say kind of roughly 10 minutes more then, so give you a few minutes before your
thank you. That would be great.
Next one.
I think it's quite interesting to look at Manchester. If you see the number of skyscrapers that have popped up in the past few years, he could almost be considered a borough of London, quite similar to Croydon. I think there has to be some kind of creative spirit up there to build so many tall buildings and increase the density. I don't know what your thoughts are.
I love Manchester. I genuinely love Manchester. I went up there once. Funny enough, I went up there once to speak at a lunch and come back. And as I was going into the train station, I saw Bill Nighy coming down the escalators as I went up. And it was one of those weird moments where he clearly recognised me as I recognised him. And we had a little nod of acknowledgement and went on our way. And I'd love to meet him one day and ask whether that I was right in thinking we'd recognised one another. But I love Manchester. I really enjoy going there when we go on conference. You know, Birmingham is also one of our great cities. I personally love Yorkshire. You know, we've got a great country. You know, every corner of it is capable of being conservative. You know, let's not forget we do get support in Scotland for all the difficulties with the SNP, but we've got to make ourselves, again, it's attractive. A lot of politics is almost more like dating than business. You've got to be attractive to the people you would like to vote for you, because they've got to trust you that if they elect you, you're going to look after them. And, you know, and you've got to have articulated what looking after their best interests is actually going to be like. You know, sometimes it is necessary to have a policy U-turn. And I think people can live with policy U-turns if they can see that that U-turn is in their best interests. But if you U-turn and you've just broken a promise, that's clearly not on. But people need to be able to trust you, and that's why so much time, I think, is in politics is spent undermining trust. But you know, when I look at Manchester, I see the cooperative spirit, and you know, I love cooperatives. Why? And in a place for a free society, there should be cooperatives. Why do I love them? Because they embody this great virtue of freely chosen collaboration with other people. So I love the Rochdale pioneers' spirit, this idea that their kids were being fed chalk and whatever else in adulterated food. And so they set up their own food supply chain and shops. Well, good on them. And Tories Conservatives should never have stood against the cooperative movement. The cooperative movement should want to be part of us. Now, when you look at Manchester, that working class cooperative spirit is absolutely vibrant in Manchester, and somehow it doesn't belong to us. Well, it should. This word solidarity that doesn't often belong to us is one that should. But it's solidarity without the compulsion of the state. So to me, a virtuous action is one freely chosen. I mean, if you do something because you must, you know, that it may or may not be a good action, but the virtue has been stripped out of it by the compulsion. If you do something because you ought, well, that's a bit better. But if you do something that is right because you choose to do it, then that's virtuous, and that's part of our fulfillment and our self-actualization. And that plays into the conservative little platoons, looking after our communities, because looking after our communities is a thing we choose to do because it's right. So I think there's a virtuous way that we can appeal to that cooperative Labour spirit in the north. But I think it's also possibly the best chance the Labour Party has of coming back. You know, somebody like Andy Burnham capturing that spirit and ending up trespassing into our territory. But quite honestly, if we end up that British politics is a contest between the Conservative Party and the Labour Party to offer a spirit of free market cooperation, then I don't think that's a bad contest for us to be having. It's a hell of a lot better than the current contest we have, which is to see who can make the best attempt to use the wide-ranging levers of coercive power of the state, which is not the contest I want us to be having.
Yeah, I agree. And I think lots of constituencies, both in the north and in the south, kind of vote Labour just because, you know, their parents have always voted Labour and all their friends have always voted Labour without drilling down to the politics. I mean, even in London, I was campaigning for London Mayor for Sean Bailey, and lots of them was kind of oh yeah, Sadiq's my man, but couldn't name a single one of his policies. So I mean, we're kind of getting that a little bit in the southeast, but it's mainly the Lib Dems that are catching up. Although I believe in Wickham, it is Labour who are really starting to catch up. So I was looking at it a while ago because I used to obviously live nearby.
Wickham's long been a Labour Conservative contest. The Lib Dems, have an important presence. But if you go back to 2001, it was close between Labour and the Conservative Party then, as it was in 17 and 19. And there's no getting away from it. I'm incredibly proud that I believe I attract thousands of British Asian votes. And I'm incredibly proud that we have British Asian councillors in the Conservative Party in Wycombe. We've got an amazing job done of integration. But equally, it can just be seen as a matter of fact that when Labour have a British Asian councillor, it's a close contest. And that is the fact which has happened. If you look at I have a chart of the number of votes cast in Wycombe since 2001, and it tells its own story. In the last election, I lost 2,000 votes to the Liberal Democrats because I've been so hardline on Brexit. Understandably, I had upset many Conservative voters, and I would very much like to persuade those Conservatives to come back. And I believe I can. I've just got to make myself attractive to them as a voting proposition. But, you know, there is a particular phenomenon at work in Wycombe, and there's not a great deal that I can do about it.
Yeah, I think it was a similar thing in most constituencies that had a swing towards Lib Dem, especially in the southeast, whereas it was normal Tory voters expressing their displeasure over Brexit. So what will be interesting is whether those Tory voters remain Lib Dem voters or whether they'll come back to the party in 2024.
Yeah, well, you may know that I won an award of, I shared Politician of the Year with Ken Clarke in the Civility and Politics Awards, which I'm very proud to have done. And that's partly because of the speech I made as we left the EU, which was deliberately, openly respectful of the other view. And for that, I won that prize. I think, you know, they will have looked at other factors, but for that willingness to be humble, and I feel myself welling up thinking about it now. You know, I am sorry that there has been so much division and anger over this issue. I really am. Perhaps I could have reasonably foreseen it, but in any event, I didn't. But I'm afraid I thought that we would make our case for a change and persuade many more people than we did. And I very much regret the extent of the division and so on. So by this being open and honest about that a bit partly because it is earnest and true, that seems to be going some way to winning people back. But that's a very individual phenomenon. But I think our party needs to do more of it. Our party cannot ever take people for granted. And I'm not suggesting it is doing, but we need to just always make sure we appeal. I'll go back to that Leonard Reed thing, how to advance liberty. You've got to make it attractive so that people want their liberty.
Yeah, Brexit was definitely an interesting issue. Obviously, at the time, I was only 16, so couldn't vote. I was kind of on the fence, but leaning Remain at the time. But since then, due to the actions of the European Union more than any compelling argument from British Brexiteers, was what tipped me into the Leave camp.
Well, I went through the same journey. So I was in favour of a fully federal Europe. I've put that on the record. I was all for it. I was in favour of the euro. But it was the actions of the European Union in putting their constitution through positively without a vote. Now, 2006 will seem like a lifetime ago to you guys, I'm afraid. But I remember it vividly. You know, the constitution was due to have referenda in all the countries, but France and Holland, I've even forgotten that now, said no. So they came forward with the Lisbon Treaty, which was materially the same, but they did it just to avoid having constitutional referenda. They changed the constitution of France to avoid having a referendum, and they made the Irish vote twice. It's all on my blog. As it happened, I blogged about it. If you go back to my early blog posts, they're all there on stevebaker.info, cataloguing this. But that turned me into a Brexiteer. I thought, I am not willing to live under a political system which doesn't care about our opinion as the voters. And that alone turned me into a Brexiteer. There are many other factors, but we cannot give up democratic control of political power, especially in a complex world, because mistakes will be made. We need power under control in a free society.
Interestingly, the way I heard about all this mess with the Lisbon Treaty, etc., was from a very unlikely source. It was from For the Record, David Cameron's book, and he was obviously a very kind of pro-Remain but pro-reform. But was kind of listening to all the things that were going wrong in there. So I was already kind of leaning Leave at that point, just from the EU's actions during the negotiations.
You know, I
alone.
went to see David Cameron in 2015 after I'd launched Conservatives for Britain, and we sat down in his office, and it was me and David Cameron and his political secretary. And I'd asked for the time because I'd had several front pages over several weeks about this big growing movement, Conservatives for Britain. And I wanted to reassure him that I wasn't trying to destroy the Conservative Party. I was trying to do my bit to hold these warring factions together, you know, insofar as it was up to me as a relatively, you know, new backbencher. And, you know, he'd sort of laughed it off, but he actually sat there and rehearsed to me the speech he would make if he decided we should leave. I couldn't believe it. I sat there agog. It was a beautiful speech. I wish I had the words. I wish he would one day publish the words. But he literally sat there and practiced the speech he would make if we were to leave. And I thought, wow, that he could actually be for leave. But there we are, he wasn't. But he definitely, I'm very clear in my own mind that he not only considered it, but that he went as far as writing the speech.
Is this the strange thing about Boris Johnson? So he wrote, apparently, a speech in favour and a speech against.
But I'm not surprised. I mean, why? It's a finely judged decision. You know, Sajid Javid was always very Eurosceptic, and then he wrote an article saying that we had to stay because it was basically too difficult to leave and too late. But you know what? Actually, Sajid gave the best possible argument. It turned out he was the most accurate person. It very, very nearly was too difficult to leave. Sajid was right. You know, I was annoyed with him at the time, but Sajid was right. It was very nearly too difficult to leave. And if we'd left it another couple of years, it certainly, I think, would have been too difficult. But, you know, we've got to let these bygones be bygones. We are now out. We're out with a satisfactory set of agreements, some of which need revising, like the Northern Ireland Protocol obviously needs to be improved. But that improvement requires goodwill. If we're going, it's an agreement. You know, you have to compromise and agree. But at the moment, they are forcing us to violate our own territorial integrity. And there's all sorts of talk about good and bad faith. I don't, you know, without wishing to say anything too newsworthy, but I have sat down with ambassadors of other European countries, and they have said to me, "We do not wish to threaten your territorial integrity." I said, "Well, that's great news, but the protocol does." But of course, all of the European nations remain fervently committed to the protocol, but they're doing it because that's the line to take if you're an EU member state. But do you really think that the arrangements on the Irish border are a top 5 issue for President Macron or the Chancellor of Germany or any of the heads of states of any of the other countries apart from the UK and Ireland?
Not for a second, they're being rather silly.
So I wouldn't, well, yeah, I mean, I can see why you'd say that, but I wouldn't say they were silly exactly. I would just say that I'm afraid at the moment, very, very grave risks are being taken with the political stability and prosperity of Europe over a problem that could be relatively easily solved with a bit of goodwill and an actual good faith acceptance that the UK needs to be territorially protected, subject to the provisions in the Good Friday Agreement, which requires a referendum on a united Ireland, should that be what the will of the people is. I'm slightly up against it. I've got 2 minutes to get to my meeting.
Yes, I was going to say, I'm conscious that we're running out of time, so maybe kind of closing remarks from you and kind of any advice for those interested in going into politics.
I just want to say thank you for having me along. Thank you for this really interesting conversation. Thank you for the encouragement. And, you know, when you've published this on your YouTube channel, I think we've covered quite a lot of subjects. So if you let me know, I will put it on my social media so that people can watch what we've said.
Great, thank you, and keep up the good work, Steve.
All right, Ben, you're a great man. Thanks very much for having me along, everybody. Really appreciate it.